That looks a lot better. Hello everybody, welcome back to the channel. It is Saturday, which means it's time for another update. To the keenly eyed of you, you may notice that I managed to unshitify the video, and all it took was coming to terms that my 5-year-old webcam wasn't hot shit anymore. So, to commemorate me turning 29 last Monday, I decided to get myself a new webcam. Is it gonna offer anything new of value to these videos? Do you need to see this dumpster fire in high definition? I don't know. What I do know is that it's about time we started our video report. So, let's get right into it. Every once in a while, I'm gonna come across a question that I ask myself. What is the player supposed to be doing in this game? It's a question that kind of demoralizes you because it makes you think, man, we've been doing all this modeling and texturing and all this music and sound effects and everything, and then there's still nothing for the player to do. Even though I have a general understanding of the image, the final product, the general experience, once I get down to it on a granular level, looking at the level, the environment, the first zone that the player is supposed to be arriving, there's very little to actually do. So I posted this in a comment under one of my work in progress posts on Godot Reddit, and I got an answer from the gentleman saying that this is a direct result of a shoot, aim, ready principle of handling a project, which is essentially when you go balls deep into developing the project before you actually plan it out or develop what it is you're trying to work on. And out of the entire post, I found the very last thing to be the most helpful. He said to start by writing, I want to make a game where, and basically outline everything you want this game to be at its core. So if I were to define what the Angular project is, I would say it is a narrative-focused space detective puzzle mystery. And now with that definition, I can start thinking of in what ways can I support this definition? What game mechanics, encounters, narrative can I put into the game in order to support this definition? And coincidentally, to help me deal with this issue, the lead designer of the Outer Wilds game, which is the game that inspired the Angular project, had come out with a GDC talk about how they went about designing their narrative flow for the game, how they progressed the story forward, being an open world game and being a game that's open-ended, where it doesn't funnel you in a particular direction and lets you uncover the mystery in whichever way you'd like. A lot of the notes gave me the idea of how I can approach this particular bottleneck, this particular writer's block, so to speak, in the Angular project in this very first zone. What is the player supposed to do? So, since the definition of this project is a narrative space detective game, I decided to concentrate on the narrative part of that definition. What are all the ways we can deliver a narrative? Well, one way would be through the environment, and this isn't necessarily through the show don't tell methodology. This is more being able to collect information about the world, about the alien race, about the species, about its people, about its characters, about its customs. So this got me thinking, through what methods can I deliver that information? Now, the most preferred way would be through show don't tell, but that is a highly planned out concept, and I think it's going to be almost redundant to do the show no tell method for everything, for the entire history of this alien race. Although in the Outer Wilds DLC, there is, as far as I know, not a single piece of written text that the player ever reads. There is alien text, but it is foreign to the player and they cannot translate it. So the information is entirely delivered through these memory cards, these memory slides, I should say. And that pretty much goes through the show don't tell, but it's literally slides. It's probably as bottom of the barrel show don't tell level you can, because you are quite literally in some of those points feeding the player directly the information, exactly what happened in the most literal sense, so it's just a stone throw away from basically telling the player what it is. I mean, one of the secrets was a location of a specific cave, and all you had to do is watch basically a movie that showed you where the characters went to get to that cave. I mean, at that point, it's pretty straightforward. So I figured, you know what? Okay, we're gonna leave show don't tell for the most important information, or for something that will help us lay down mystery. For example, a painting of a home world with 3 giant scratches across it, or a petrified statue of an alien reaching out for something atop a pedestal, and yet that pedestal is empty. The most important stuff is what we're gonna try to come up with clever show don't tell applications. But for the more routine, mundane background information about, let's say, the customs of the aliens, I decided to borrow an idea from Subnautica with a hand scanner, which you use to scan various objects in the environment and get information about them. Now, this kind of a tool has a particular interesting application to also lay down some mystery, like, for example, scanning objects that do not return a clearly defined material, meaning that it's so foreign that even the scanner cannot tell what it is. Or at least it can give us such information that simply further pushes down the mystery, like, for example, describing that a chunk of statue exhibits activity. Another example that I came up with while working on this is, at some point the player is going to reach the alien research laboratory where they were trying to figure out how to combat these statues. And in that laboratory they will have a number of analytical equipment. Now, I could follow the show don't tell principle and design, let's say, a microscope to look kind of alien, but at the same time still resemble a human-made microscope. So in that case, I don't need to tell the player what this object is. Now, that's interesting, and that's one way to approach it, and probably I would be leaning more towards that. But if I have this environmental scanner, I could make the microscope as wild looking as I want, and I could mark it as a scannable object that the player can use the scanner on, analyze it, and get information of the possible uses. And I could place this piece of analytical equipment up, and beneath it, I could place a totally foreign, different-looking object, like a piece of the statue, and it would also be a scannable object. So when the player scans the piece of the statue, it would say, unknown materials exhibits activity. And when they scan the big piece of alien machinery, the scanner would say, sensors detected. This piece of machinery was likely used to analyze data. So the player can then piece 2 and 2 together. This must be a microscope of some sort, or some piece of analytical equipment. Now, I'm kind of torn between these two cases, because with show don't tell, the player can piece the data together just by what they see, but with the second method, it kind of gamifies the process. It turns it into a gameplay mechanic. You can piece the information together, but you do gotta scan the data first. It may sound kind of boring, but who knows? I mean, if the information you get in response is information about the lore or the backstory or additional mystery, something to revitalize your interest in the main story, then maybe that alone should be worth it. This was one of the key points that I extrapolated from that GDC talk from the Outer Wilds narrative developer. Their main concept is to reward player with knowledge, to reward player with bits of the story that they can piece together, another piece of the puzzle that they can put into the grander picture. And it's a game that is specifically catered for those who are trying to uncover a mystery. That part of the game had extreme hold of me when I was playing it. I mean, to be honest, if I could whack myself in the head and forget one game so I can experience it all over again, it would be Outer Wilds. Because for me, uncovering that main mystery was the biggest drive of playing that game. I am a huge stickler for mystery, especially when there's bits of science fiction and horror mixed into it. So this GDC talk had closely resonated with what I am trying to create for the Angler project. I want to build this colossal main mystery. I want to design a narrative game that makes the player ask questions. What happened here? Why is this here? What is this? Why? How did it all come down here? This talk made me see that the scope of how much work you have to put into the design of the script, into design of the narrative in the game is stupendously large if you want to be able to pull it off effectively. The moment the player is given control of the game, we have to lay down the core mystery. We have to captivate their attention with some big question, some grandiose mystery, and then start feeding them little bits and bits and bits of information to keep that interest alive. And in the meantime, also make sure that there's a constant stream of gameplay mechanics that will keep the player engaged as they are trying to answer those questions. And some of those game mechanics would have to be directly tied into the principle of mystery, uncovering the mystery, answering questions. With each question answered, provide an extra little bit of information that would be useful for the player with the rest of their detective journey. So this scanner object was the first idea I got that would help me push that gameplay style, push the narrative of the project. With the scanner in place, the player can analyze any object of interest. Of course, not every object should have a scannable component to it, and most of the objects have to serve some sort of a purpose from a narrative standpoint, so the player isn't spending a lot of time scanning useless stuff or completely useless stuff. Basically teaching the player that not everything scannable is important. You can skip some things, which would teach them to not really appreciate the scanner tool as much. Which is why I'm gonna have to be careful about which objects are scannable, which are not. There could be some regular mundane objects, like to tell the story that this alien race was heavy into social gatherings. Some of the scannable objects could be very simple, like teacups and pots and kettles. When scanned, the scanner would present the information that the residue within these containers indicates highly efficient mixes of herbs, which facilitated in cognitive development as well as offered rejuvenating properties, and worded in such a way that it describes the aliens as a very social creatures. They appreciated tea time by, let's say, the sheer amount of these little clusters of tea consuming areas within this religious temple, as well as lay down the clues that this alien race was heavy into conducting all sorts of scientific research in order to advance their conquest of the planets, to the point where they made use of these herbal mixes to enrich their ability to work on their projects for longer without exhaustion. So it wouldn't push the main story forward by that much, but it would paint a picture of what these aliens are like. Kind of makes me consider that maybe some scannable objects could be color coded to contain more important information, so you could target those if you don't really want researching every aspect of their daily lives. Other than that, the objects that we could make scannable would be statues and icons, tables and ornaments, carvature, scientific equipment, artifacts they've brought with them. Another idea I had is how to tell that this alien race brought something with them to remind them of their home. Well, the temple area is filled with display cabinets, stands, within which some sort of an object from the home world is situated on display to remind them of what they have lost. So to communicate that, I could make the object on the stand and the stand itself be scannable, and I could mark that the object within the stand is dated to be much older than the display cabinet itself, whereas the display cabinet could have some scannable information telling the player that a lot of work went into carving this cabinet, which indicates that a lot of care was put into it, a lot of craftsmanship. It would take many years to carve out a cabinet, which means whatever they displayed within this cabinet would have to present some very precious value to this alien race. So through those little notes, using the environmental scanner, the player could establish a connection with this alien race through these seemingly human-like behaviors. I mean, you and I have plenty of things that we cherish, things that we hold dear. So piecing the two and two together, or getting that information from the scanner, is gonna help us connect with the aliens using these common behaviors, even though they've been dead for many, many thousands of years. Now, while developing this, I initially made the scanner have a sphere-based expansion effect and a directional expansion effect, where it basically just shoots a flat shield towards some sort of a surface, and then when it contacts it, it detects a scannable object and make it reveal itself. Now, I decided to discard the directional scanner entirely and only work on the sphere expansion scanner. And the left click, which used to be reserved for the directional scanner, now became the analysis button. So the general mechanic is you use the right mouse button to emit this spherical scan field, which as it grows, it will contact objects that have been marked as scannables. Now, technically, to make that part easy, the scannables part isn't actually baked into the object. I simply made a separate area node, which is acting as a scannable property of an object. And I just drop that area into whatever object I would like to make scannable, and when the scanner field touches that area, it tells it to reveal the dot. Now, while the dot is revealed, it allows us to then walk up to it and then left click with the scanner while generally looking at that object, at which point the circular progress bar would appear, and as soon as that is done filling up, it would give us the information about that object. Now, I've also programmed it so that I could vary the amount of time you have to scan the object, and sometimes while you're scanning, it might actually disappear. I don't know if that's good or bad, because you can keep right-clicking in order to keep it on, which could be considered a part of gameplay mechanic, or it could just be annoying, and I'm just gonna have to make sure that while you are scanning the object, it wouldn't disappear. The scan time adjustment is something that might look cool when you're trying to scan different objects of different sizes. A larger object would take a little bit longer to scan, so maybe while you are scanning it, you have to constantly ping out this scanner field in order to keep the dot visible. So maybe at that point, it is a gameplay mechanic instead of an oversight. So with the scanner field, I actually got an interesting idea for a potential horror section that we can employ. The scanner field has a light inside of it, an omni light, and I had to place it in order to make the scanner object be visible. It used to receive lighting from surrounding environment, which means if you actually scan something in dark, you wouldn't see the field either, which didn't really make sense. It felt more like a holographic object, so why wouldn't it be visible? Now, if it's a holographic object, it would emit light of its own. So I placed an omnilight into the sphere and made the omnilight range grow with the sphere radius, which made it look like you could use it as a light source even if there's nothing really to scan in the environment. So I thought, wouldn't it be cool if the player were to lose their flashlight at some point, maybe not have access to any drones, and now all they have is this scanner object. They're in pitch black, and they just have to use the scanner in order to traverse and navigate the surrounding environment. And now you can introduce some totems into it that are roaming the hallways, and then, well, that's just a recipe for a really interesting horror action sequence. Now, usually I spend 2 days a week working on Angular, but Monday was slightly squandered, so I had ended up not working on another one of the projects, the Dreadtail, in favor of finishing up the Angular's environmental scanner mechanic. It is just about fully functional now. There are just a couple of bugs I still need to sort out, but for the most part, it is all working nice. Now, the way I've set up the scannable object area node, of course, turned it into a scene so I can drag and drop a new one into whatever object I'd like to make scannable. But the general application of it is not just to scan inanimate objects or not just to scan routine objects. It is also meant to scan bodies of text or pieces of written information, like for example a plaque underneath a very large painting of some planet, for example. Now this ties into the data tablets mechanic, where there are these alien data tablets scattered all over the ship, and when you find one, you're supposed to decrypt it in order to read the contents within, which is supposed to be done using these floating dots that you have to connect with the lines. And of course, if you connect the incorrect dot, the encryption would fail and you have to try that again, but you have to keep in mind that you're not supposed to touch a particular dot. Now, that particular mechanic is reminiscent of maybe hacking in Fallout, where when you find a set of parentheses or brackets, a matching set of parentheses or brackets, an opening and a closing one, it would usually either reset your tries or it would remove a dud. So a password which, if you try to click on it, it would fail, and then you're going to lose one of your tries before you get locked out of the computer. Now, what I decided to do is borrow the dud removing idea, the dot removal mechanic, but we are not doing anything remotely close to the Fallout's password hacking mechanic in this game. You're just connecting dots together. So in order to grant the player the mechanic of being able to remove some of the duds that would cause their decryption process to fail, the player will be given a decryption node, a usable resource, every time they scan a piece of text within the world using the environmental scanner. So if there's a giant painting and there's a plaque beneath it, when the player uses the scanner on the plaque, they will translate it, but they will also get one decryption node for them to use next time they come across an alien data tablet that hasn't been decrypted before. So the more written material they scan, the more decryption nodes they will get as a reward. Now, of course, this also means that they will be motivated to seek out written data and scan it to get decryption nodes, because further and further data tablets would become more and more difficult to hack, or decrypt, I should say, because they would have more and more duds floating about that you shouldn't be touching. So this way the player is motivated to seek out written text, and of course when they scan written text they still get the translation for it. It's right there, might as well read it. So that's another method of narrative delivery that I thought would be a good supporting mechanic for this game. And there was very little additional code that I had to write to make the scannable object area grant a node. Honestly, at this point, Godot Engine allows us to define export variables, so I just made a single checkbox that says, do you get a decryption node when you scan and analyze this object? So all I have to do is place this area into some sort of a written piece of text, like a plaque or stand or a tabloid, and when the player scans it, they will get a decryption node. And at that point, I actually also got a chance to touch up on the very basic mechanic of notification messages that pop up on the screen when the player performs certain actions. That would be important for establishing communication with the player, mainly communicating to the player, your current action have rewarded you with a decryption node. So when the player does scan a piece of text, they will see a pop-up notification appear to the side of the screen saying you got one decryption node. Now that notification system is modular, so I don't have to use it only for getting notification for decryption nodes. I could replace that message with stuff like you're running out of oxygen, low fuel, you gotta get back to your NPC soldier warden who is got some information now that you've reached this particular point that will help you progress the story forward. I generally want to keep this game user interface light. We already have a lot going on with the health and fuel and booster bar, the inventory hotbar at the bottom, so I generally want to try to keep user interface at a minimal just to maintain a level of immersion. So that is it for the Angular project. Let's move on to the next entry. For the RTAG Rise project, we continue working on the very first area you're supposed to experience when you play the demo of the game. Now, what's interesting is that the mechanics here are the kind of mechanics we're probably going to be reusing all throughout the entire game. These mechanics include picking up and dropping objects and interacting with the generators. Now, the mechanic for picking up and placing objects is programmed in a modular fashion, which means after I programmed it here, I can now make any rigid body be pickupable by the player. All I have to do is just add it to a node group, and that's it. We can now pick up and let go of that object. And that's going to come in handy because right now we can only pick up and place the briefcase, which has to be transported all over the level in order to constantly keep it cool. But later on, after a predetermined amount of time or after a certain amount of actions is performed within this test chamber, the secondary objective, which is you bringing the plasma orbs of different colors to a receptacle, would come into play. And to bring the plasma orb, all you have to do is walk up to it, pick it up, and deliver it to the receptacle, which is the exact same mechanic as the briefcase uses right now to pick it up and transport it around the level. Now, the second mechanic is interaction with the generators. These generators are going to be used all over the level to bring various parts of the facility online so you can complete those challenges. And while testing the mechanic, trying to get the timing just right, I noticed two major problems. The first problem is that I wasn't really communicating what these generators even do. It isn't clear what these things are. There's a button measure, sure, and sure, the character does say, we need to bring the generators online. But other than that, nothing in this game really communicates that these things are generators, that they are powering something, that they're connected to something. So what I decided to do is develop a small set of sprites that will act as conduits, that will illustrate the power flow from the generator and visually connect to some object in the level. In this case, it would be the teleporter in the middle of the scene, and I would simply run these lines and conduits from the generator up to the object that that generator is supposed to be powering in order to communicate where the line is actually going, what it's connected to, and most importantly, whether or not that particular line is on or off, which of course tells you if the generator is on or off. This is an idea that I borrowed from the Portal games, especially from the Portal 1, where you have to deliver this plasma ball into a receptacle, and then that powers the receptacle, and there's a series of dots going from the receptacle up to, say, a door. And when the receptacle receives the plasma orb, the dots actually light up, indicating that there is now power. So I borrowed that approach to communicating to the player that there is power going through these lines, and I made two versions of each conduit sprite, one lit up and one in its dormant state. And again, in order to make this thing reusable and modular, what I've done is I've attached script to a parent node within which all these conduits exist, and I made a script that essentially loops through the children of that parent node, and the children checks, is the name of the sprite supposed to be a line, or is it supposed to be a circular conduit? And based on which one it is, and based on whether or not there's actually power flowing through it, which is the variable called on, it's either true or false, it would swap out the sprite to either a glowing one or a non-glowing one, respectively. And even though we did have the rotary dial that has to be in the green line, communicating to the player whether or not the generator is on or off, this made it a heck of a lot easier because that little indicator is just a teeny tiny little sprite, but these lines could span across the entire level, and they very clearly communicate if they're on or off. So when the generator turns off, the entire conduit array turns off as well, and you can see that quite easily. And the second problem with the generators is that I noticed that their implementation is very singular. I wanted the player to interact with the generators for a little bit longer, and right now, in order to bring power to this particular test chamber, you have to go run up to generator number 1, and then button mash the controller in order to get the dial into the green zone, at which point the generator is technically considered online, and then you have to run over to the other generator, and then you have to bash the button again, same thing, bring the indicator to the green zone so that generator becomes online, and then you have to get to the third one, rinse and repeat, and then at some point you have to run back to the first one in order to button mash it again, because while you've been dealing with the other two, the first one started dissipating. But all it took was to get all 3 generators into the green zone, and that's it. The power would come online. Now that to me seemed like a little bit boring, because all you have to do is really memorize the timing of the generators or how fast the generators dissipate, and then simply enable the generators in that order and just get over it and be done with this objective within the first 1 or 2 minutes, even less than 1 minute realistically. So that's not a very interesting or engaging objective when you just kind of enable it once and throw it off. So what I decided to do is, instead of having all 3 generators be in the green zone and then the power coming on instantly, I decided to develop a power accumulation conduit. Now, this mechanic was meant to extend the amount of time you have to engage with the generators in order for you to reap the benefits. You see, whereas before, if you figured out the timing of all the generators, you could just run up to generator number 2, then number 1, then number 3, and turn them all at once, and that's it. That objective is done. But now, you have to get this power accumulation conduit to fill up all the way in order for it to then turn on whatever device you're trying to power, or technically to trigger the next timed event within this whole action sequence. So this means the player now has to keep running around between the 3 generators, keep them in the green zone in order for all 3 generators to feed the power accumulator constantly. And not only that, the power accumulator, again, is made in a very modular fashion. So I can tell it to keep an eye out for 1 generator or 2 or 10. We can make as many inputs as we can, and all of those inputs have to be online in order for the power accumulator to accumulate power. So if one of the generators goes down, no accumulation, and if you have not re-enabled that generator within, let's say, 4 seconds, it's going to start dropping. And of course, that particular option is toggleable. I could disable it so that it just stays exactly where it is. Again, it's a very modular approach to it, which allows me to very easily introduce variations of the same challenges and puzzles without having to program an entirely new type of conduit just to make that work. So now the objective of the player is to keep all 3 generators in the green zone, which means you have to parkour around the level and then keep approaching the generator, button mash to get it back to the green zone, and then maintain all 3 generators within the green zone to let the conduit to fully charge. Once it fully charges, then we can actually trigger whatever scripted event's supposed to happen next. Now, the next challenge within this chamber that I haven't had a chance to work on yet, but I'm looking forward to doing that now, is the last component, which is delivering the multicolored orbs to the receptacle in order to, quote-unquote, dial in the correct address for this teleporter. So there's going to be a screen. The screen displays which colored plasma orb it requires right now, and the player has to run up to the dispenser located in one of the corners of this room, snatch it up, which of course is just going to be using the mechanic we've already programmed for carrying the suitcase, pick it up, pick up the plasma orb, deliver it, parkour around it. We could additionally make it so that you cannot let it hit the walls too much or make it be impacted too much, because otherwise it's just going to get destroyed. Or we could place certain lasers or certain zones within which the object cannot exist. It should not exist. So you should avoid having the plasma orb be at any point be contained within that particular zone. So this will provide the third and final challenge, and after that it's just a matter of setting up the scripted events and getting the story to trigger our remaining recorded dialogues and letting the whole thing play out. And that's of course the part where the narrative starts falling together, and I can't wait to work on that part. Now, the core mechanic has been done by that point, and I had a few minutes left before it was just about a 1-hour episode. So for the last few minutes, I decided to gussy it up a bit with a bit of a special effect. I know, I said I wasn't gonna do any of the pretty detailed stuff, but I couldn't help myself. I just wanted to make something pretty. I had this really interesting idea where, well, at least interesting to me, when the lines would light up when they're actually powered, there's sparks flying off of random locations on that line. Now, the way I achieved it is very simple. I used a path to D node, and I plotted a simple path along all of the conduits, the lines and the connecting conduits, and I placed into the path to D node a path follow to D node, and effectively created a separate scene with particles that emitted a single burst of sparks and then just destroyed themselves when the particles died out. So all I had to do is set up a timer, and every time the timer times out, the path follow to D is positioned anywhere randomly along the path. I use the unit offset property within, which is a value between 0 and 1, which means no matter how long your path is, the 0 is always the beginning, 1 is always the end. So just randomly position it anywhere along the path and grab its global position, and at that position instance a new burst of particles by instancing the scene with the particle emitter. And that's it. It's just doing that, rinse and repeat on a loop, only as long as the line is actually powered. And that's it. I swear, that's all that I wanted to do. No extra special effects. The whole thing took me maybe about 10 minutes to set up, so put down your pitchforks. I got it. I got the message. Now, the final note on this project is I wanted to note a bit of a dum-dum moment for me, because this power accumulator bar has a rotary interface that fills up all around the unit. Now, in the past projects, this is actually something that I teach, and this is something that I used in my other projects, the Angular project for the health and fuel and booster user interface. I would actually handcraft that user interface from scratch. I would use Blender to position a camera from the top and use Bezier curves with a custom fill effect in order to animate a circular progress bar filling up one frame at a time. Usually it would be about 100 frames in total. Like, the whole process would be automated. It's very easy to set up, and I would just render out the whole animation, and I would get my rotary animation in place, my rotary user interface progress bar in place. But I didn't realize that Godot actually already has a node that does exactly that. I believe it's called a texture progress node. There's a regular progress node, which is like a fill bar that fills up and down, and you can set the minimum and maximum values in it. But this one is called texture progress, and it has multiple modes. Look, guys, I know that you're not really supposed to talk about one engine being better than the other. You can use whatever engine you want. But when I come across this type of a feature, and I recall that if I wanted to make the same thing in GameMaker Studio or in AppGameKit, I would have to code it either from scratch with vectors or hand animate it in Blender. I truly have to say, can we really not make that distinction? Because I only have to add that one node, and now I have a rotary, fully customizable interface. I can set the minimum maximum values, I can set the step, I can set all these things that would have to be programmed from scratch in a lot of other engines. Or you have to rely on community-made assets, which is another thing. It's just downloading, having to figure out their code. Hopefully it's well documented. Sometimes it is. Most of the time it isn't. And there's been multiple times when Godot engine has blown my mind, thinking, why don't other engines have this? Like, for example, the resource preloader node that I found out about last week. I posted one of these report videos. Somebody in the comments said, why don't you use the resource preloader node? And I go, the what? Like, to be honest, if I read the documentation, I will know about these things. They will probably blow my mind when I read the docs, and, well, I probably won't be making a video about them. But man, am I glad Yo-Yo fucked up their free evaluation software that made me want to look into alternatives. It seems like a trend as of late, isn't it? The company of your preferred engine of choice doing something stupid and forcing you to look for alternatives, and then we stumble upon Godot and we're like, wow, this is a tool of opportunities. How come I've never touched this before? And yes, I know that I'm mispronouncing it. I've said it once too many times. I can never go back now. There is no going back. For me, it will forever be Godot. I'm sorry. Anyways, enough ranting, and let's move on to the next project in the progress report. The Child of Ether project has probably been the most productive one this week, and it's, again, all thanks to the Reddit answer and the GDC talk. There was an interesting parallel mentioned in both, and that parallel would be that you have to make a very clear definition of what your project is, because in the GDC talk, the narrative developer had specified that the Outer Wilds project had very specific goals and very specific definitions that helped it maintain its course along the development. And one of those definitions was that the game is supposed to reward the player for their curiosity. Now, that particular mission statement alone is super useful, especially for my games, because I am mostly interested in narrative games, and I'm mostly interested in sci-fi, mystery, fiction, mixed with horror. But the fact that there was a definition alone, and the fact that the Reddit answer also said that I have to clearly define what the games are about, had resonated into just about all of the projects that I'm working with. By defining what your project goal is, it helps me maintain course towards reaching that project and analyze everything that I develop to aid that particular mission statement, that particular definition. Also, I started thinking about getting these projects to some sort of a minimum playable state, because I have recently, as a reward for getting all this stuff done, have been playing some older games that I've always liked to revisit, like, for example, The Forest, and I noticed some interesting trend in those games. Those games originally came out as creative games, and only later on they've added story to them. And another game that I drew that same parallel with was a game called Subnautica. The same exact concept was enacted there, where the game initially started as a creative game, survival underwater in an alien planet, and only later they started patching the story, the actual core mystery, into that game. So that, to me, is evidence that that particular development process can work if you are diligent enough to keep pushing updates. Now, I am sure that both of those games ended up earning a fair number of haters, or a fair number of displeased customers who expected the game to be way more at the point when they purchased it. As a matter of fact, that is another parallel I drew with the developer of the Death Trash game, which is an indie post-apocalyptic tech cyberpunk game that I'm following the developer on Twitter. He's posted multiple times screenshots of reviews of people on Steam posting bad reviews, complaining that the game isn't finished, that it's lacking content, even though smack in the middle of the entire game and smack in the middle of the page, the actual store page, in very bold, very clear letters, it says, "This project is unfinished. If you expect a complete experience, do not purchase this game." So even though all those notices are there, the people are still expecting it to be finished, and they get disappointed, and I'm sure that they usually close the game and never open it again. So there are some risks to that particular approach. But to me, to be honest, if I can push out these projects sooner than later, and maybe build up some sort of a dedicated fan base who are actually excited for that particular project, some of them will drop off, some of them will stay, but at least it will allow me to make the project be exposed to the general public for a little bit longer, get valuable feedback, and, well, get this project into more of an open sea, rather than being mostly confined to my own computer and these development reports and occasional progress videos I post on the Godot subreddit, right? So not exactly a huge market that I'm reaching with just these particular fields. So what I've been doing is I've been actually purchasing the Steam publication licenses that are like $120 Canadian to publish a single game. So for Dreadtail, I've purchased one. For the VR shooter, I purchased one, which is a project that I don't think I've shown you, but it's also a project that I'm not actively working on right now. I do have all the gameplay footage, and it is one of those projects that I've never really made a progress report. If I did, I can't remember. So I would probably have to make one of those really long update report videos, just showcasing only that game and only where it sits, what sort of mechanics we've been experimenting with. But I'm not actively working on that project right now, but it is in a very close to a minimum viable product state. I'd have to develop some NPCs and some AI code and shooting mechanics, or them shooting at me, but that's about it. Like, I'm not touching that project until I maybe finish one of these. So in Child of Ether's case, I am looking for what sort of components do I need to prioritize right now to bring this project to a minimum viable product stage that I can release in that particular state, and then continue updating it with the story and the appropriate mechanics, considering, to me, the evidence from the forest and the evidence from Subnautica tells me that that is possible to develop a game that way. It would basically be in early access, and everybody, has a sour taste of early access. So unfortunately, that's the reality of things. And of course, one of my projects, Artag Rise, is on Steam in early access in its really ancient, really old, really janky, really terribly terrible user interface infused state. It's technically playable. It's made in GameMaker Studio before I discovered Godot Engine, but it doesn't really help paint a better picture for the state of early access, for the developers who put the games in early access. I mean, it's pretty much like a case of abandoned games that go into early access just to get a bunch of money. Even though I am working on this game in a different engine, I just haven't updated it. And because I haven't updated it, there's this bot that basically goes around Steam pages that checks for the dates of how long has it been since the last update and marks your game as abandonware. And I'm like, asshole. But you're right. You're totally right. So until I can actually push the new version of the game made in Godot Engine to Steam, that label, I guess, is just going to sit there. But yeah, that's... I'll chalk it up to learning experience. I have one game that's in early access that's in a terrible state. I have other games that are not in early access that are in terrible states, but we'll keep that under the blanket. Don't tell anybody. So I gotta think, what are the most top mechanics that I need to program now into Child of Ether that will allow me to achieve that minimal viable product state. So realistically, we are talking about a vertical slice, a portion of the game that very clearly documents and showcases what is the total idea that you have for the whole project, represented in this highly concentrated short slice. And this, of course, also resonates with the GDC talk and the Reddit answer of you defining very clearly what your game is about. Well, with Child of Ether, the main concept of the game is barely surviving while trying to uncover a grand mystery of the world. Again, it's a very similar concept with the Angular project. It's just a different form factor in a different setting with different characters. But the underlying foundation of it is uncovering a grand mystery. Again, this is where my interest for mystery genre just comes into play. I develop the stuff that I myself would enjoy experiencing. So in order for me to set up this vertical slice, I have to showcase gameplay revolving around narrative delivery. Now, with Angular, we had that whole idea of a scanner, which allows you to get some background information of certain objects. There is no such thing in this game, which means the same idea would have to be developed from a different perspective, using different approaches and different tools. So if I'm working on a vertical slice for this game, what I would like to demonstrate is the creative survival aspect, which means any mechanic that allow you to survive in this world, which means survival mechanics themselves like hunger, thirst. If those things would apply, maybe something more unique could be developed. This is where that aspect of the game is largely unexplored. The atmosphere is another thing that I wanted to develop. I tend to gravitate towards really dark, really gloomy, but not entirely oppressive, depressive types of atmospheres. Like, for example, the swamp level from Rayman 3, Hoodlum Havoc, or literally any game before 2010 that has a nighttime scene in it. Maybe this kind of rolls back to my really early childhood experiences with the Pajama Sam No Need to Hide When It's Dark Outside games. God, the atmosphere in that game is so spooky. It's either that or my dad showing me movies like Friday the 13th and Nightmare on Elm Street and Shining. I'd have to have a talk with my dad after this. In any case, the atmosphere would be delivered via surroundings, but most importantly via music. So music is what I can concentrate on as well. Another aspect the vertical slice would have to display is the combat system. Being able to survive and fight in this world are kind of key components to progressing around. And finally, the narrative component, which I think would be effectively delivered by a number of side quests, some interesting locations the player can scout, and not just empty locations with nothing but loot in them, but locations that actually offer some narrative sustenance. So what I'm going to be looking at doing is introducing some interesting locations and interesting encounters for the player to have. And the rest of the game will be largely focused on survival, both from just regular survival aspects of the games that you and I know about to surviving special encounters with special types of enemies, because the horror aspect is probably going to be another component that I would like to demonstrate within the vertical slice for this game. So I will be looking at developing some unique to interact with enemy types, which all would have a unique combat approach to them. In any case, what I decided to focus on in this week was the atmosphere and narrative delivery. And starting with narrative delivery, I decided to revisit the process of modeling three-dimensional props. In this world, most of the props are two-dimensional sprites with billboarding, and only the most important, the major locations, the major objects would be made out of three-dimensional components. Now, the very first house that I had built was the protagonist house, the house that we started. And that particular house, well, it was the very first of its kind. I had to learn a lot about the process, or I had to figure out the process I would go about developing it. The house that I made for the protagonist homestead was actually developed in probably the least optimized way possible. As the process of optimization goes, you usually start with the worst case scenario. I had hand painted everything. The entire house was hand painted. Every brick, every wooden panel, every rock was hand painted. It was terrible. I mean, great from the uniqueness standpoint, sure, but terrible from productivity standpoint. Most gamers would never actually notice that there's or isn't a pattern in the stone unless it's like stupendously obvious and poorly executed. But generally speaking, I decided to revisit the whole 3D model process for this particular project to see if I can optimize the process along the way. So one way is to, instead of hand painting everything, and I had an example of this big house with a big mystery inside of it, the player could go in and explore. So the model of the house itself had wooden panels, stone foundation, and brick chimney. And what I decided to do this time around is I developed 3 separate tile textures, one for brick, one for stone, one for wooden panels, and I used Substance Painter in order to basically plaster these panels, these textures all over the appropriate sides. And I tried reusing as many of those textures as I could for things like window panels, for things like the rooftop, to try to minimize the amount of time that has to be sunk into each and every one of these assets. Because if I'm working on this alone, I have to think about how much time this is all going to take. Now, the one huge benefit of doing all of the painting by yourself from scratch, meticulously painting every corner, every side, is that you have ultimate control of where the edges are actually placed. Especially the fact that the majority of the prop is semi-cell shaded. It has that cell-like shaded effect to it, which reminds me I didn't apply the cell shader effect to this building. Gonna have to put that on the list. But a lot of the corners, a lot of the edges have ink on them to make it look very cartoony. It's like a caricature. The problem is that exactly is the process that takes up the most time. Weeding out every corner, every crevice, every side, and then hand painting the ink into those spots. It produces a very nice effect, very effective look, but it takes up a massive amount of time, especially since this two-story building is twice as massive as the protagonist's house. So how do we go around this? Well, back then when I made that particular house, I didn't own a license of Substance Painter. And Substance Painter is exactly the program that allowed me to speed this process up immensely. So first of all, I started painting reusable tile textures. So I would open up Krita, make a 256 by 256 texture or 512 by 512, and I would draw out, let's say, wooden panels, long panels, wooden nails, nails in the corners, some crevices, some texturing, wooden texture, all sorts of stuff. And I would make it seamless because Krita has seamless texture painting features inside offering to us. And I would then go to Substance Painter, create a fill layer, and then make that, let's say, tiled wooden plank texture as the base color, and then I can position it, resize it, rotate it, orient it however I want, and the entire house would now have proper wooden textures around it. I can then use masking to isolate these textures so they don't actually exist all over the house, but only exist in places where they need to be. And from that point on, there was very little custom painting that I had to do, because at that point it was just me trying to cleverly reuse the same exact textures I've already made in other places. And that's kind of reminiscent of some of the videos I watched on old game dev stuff, like PS1 era games, where, for example, in Banjo-Kazooie, some of the sounds you can hear are actually reused sounds sped up or slowed down. I think Super Mario 64 might have the same quirk happening in there. Developers back then reused a lot of the assets to create some very funky effects without extra cost. So in this case, I'm just kind of trying to be a shadow of that particular practice and try to reuse these textures in turn. Now, for the hand-painted edges, the Substance Painter suit offers the edge damage, like gun edges, concrete edges. You just bake the mesh maps for your three-dimensional object, which allows Substance Painter to figure out where the corners are, where the crevices are, where the dips are, where the hills are, and then it offers various masks and various effects that either obscure or reveal your layer in those key areas. So I would just create a black layer, like inky black, and I would apply, let's say, the edge mask over that layer, and that would make that layer only appear on the edges of the building, which, surprise, surprise, looks literally exactly what I would end up with is if I painted those corners by hand. Not only that, it actually also introduces some additional scratches all over the house, all over the prop, which looks fantastic, especially for this dark and gloomy and brooding aesthetic of this particular game. So that, I think, sped up the entire process tenfold. I would say most of it is thanks to Substance Painter. The remaining of the progress for this week was me trying an alternate approach to the fences. As you've seen in the last week's report, I made the fences three-dimensional and then I textured them in Substance Painter, which actually didn't really turn out all that well. And I think it's because I had a false sense of perception of how big the object is, and I ended up putting too much detail into the texture, thinking that we're going to be able to see it, but I didn't consider that the player is actually fairly small and the camera is pretty far away, so most of the detail that I had put into the fence was, well, basically lost. Instead of trying to retexture it, I figured, you know what, for something like a fence, I think a two-dimensional asset would be way better. So I ended up repainting all the fences as two-dimensional assets, replacing the meshes with Sprite 3Ds, establishing a collision shape, and that was basically it. I think it even looks way better than it did when the assets used to be three-dimensional. The final component I got to work on this week is the atmosphere, and as I mentioned before, the way I achieve a particular atmosphere, at least until I get to write some character dialogues and write the stories, their predicaments, their dilemmas, is music. Music, well, technically visuals are very important, but for now, music. Music is a huge component that allows me to set the mood and kind of tell what the player is supposed to be feeling. After all, that's the purpose of music in media. So I got to lay down some pretty grim sounding soundscapes for the nighttime exterior and the abandoned two-story house interior. And of course, I got to finally piggyback some of the soundtracks I've written for this project way, way, way back in the beginning. A lot of those soundtracks they're actionable areas like the merchant store, the protagonist's house. These are areas where the player is supposed to spend a little bit of time doing something. So areas outside where the player just roams around, encounters all sorts of horrors. That is mostly done with ambient soundtracks, soundscapes. But anytime there's a location of interest, like a temple or a merchant, like a traveling merchant, maybe a special character that you meet, the protagonist's house, those locations would have to have their own themes, their own soundtracks. So some of those soundtracks came from way back when I started the game. The main aspect I had to program in this week's sessions was the triggering of that music. And of course, because this is a semi-open world game, I had to develop a system that was modular, that was flexible. So the way I achieved it was by creating an area node, and I attached a script to it. I programmed it to detect if the player enters it or leaves it, and I programmed it to essentially tell a singleton, which is a node that exists in the entire game rather than a particular level, to play a particular song. I preloaded all the songs into a dictionary, so everything is labeled with a particular key. All I have to do is say, when the player enters this area, take a look in your export variable and see what is the name of the song that's supposed to be played, and then tell that singleton to play that song. This allows me to, once again, in a very modular fashion, to reuse this area all over the game without having to program an extra line of code for triggering a different song. In any case, I am going to leave you now with the video demonstration of this system working. You'll hear some music, you'll see some visuals, and this would be it for this week's progress reports, and I'm hoping to see you in the next video.